Welcome to Teacher Rants and Red Pill Readings, episode number 2. The rant is now in session. And this episode, I'm going to be talking about the American civic religion, and apparently that is democracy. And if you've been listening at all to any of the pundits or commentators over the last, few months, really though, the last decades, you'll know that American leaders always like us to believe that democracy is sacred, that democracy is the end-all, be-all, and that you remember, every religion, as it were, has to have its temples, its rites and rituals, its scriptures, its priests. And so what I want to do today is sort of mention a couple of my experiences with this. And as a teacher, again, as I mentioned last episode, trying to balance that act of wanting to really educate and instill scholarship and academic values while also being realistic about what's going on around us. And that includes, having gone to D.C. I went several years ago to an economics conference, and that was pretty boilerplate and standard. But I've also gone with students I've chaperoned, and that was fairly recent. But then also, even as it pertains to me trying to engage in some what I thought was academic discourse, and finding out really the hard way that America does indeed have its rituals as part of the civic religion, and of course its high priest, who, as we know, is Abraham Lincoln. And let me just start by saying this, and then just a reminder, as I do every episode, I'll make what I think is a fantastic reading recommendation. The writer's name is Frank Chodorov, and I hope to tie that into what my discussion is today. And so, I learned the hard way years ago that Abraham Lincoln he's the one demigod in the American sort of pantheon of leaders, presidents, etc., that you simply cannot really criticize. Now, to be fair, there has been more of an effort to do this over the last, I'd say, decade, maybe 15, 20 years or so. So there are scholars now, especially in economics, and there's more to that we'll discuss at some point. But there are scholars now who have kind of questioned the Lincoln mythology. And to be frank, a lot of what Lincoln's reputation is based on mythology. And you'll find Lincoln, of course, at the top of presidential rankings. Regularly, you'll find him lauded by both the left and the right, which, by the way, should always be a telling sign, right? When both parties are so in whole hog for supporting a politician, especially executives, that's a telltale sign that, hey, something's kind of rotten here. So years ago, I decided to get involved in a little tiff academically, and it related to Thomas de Lorenzo's criticisms of Abraham Lincoln. And this was a long time ago, and actually was working for another school here locally. And what I did is I got in a sort of I guess it's a blog. I'm not sure how many blogs are around anymore, but I got in a blog, and this person whose site I was on is a fairly prominent Lincoln scholar, I suppose. And I was defending some of Thomas de Lorenzo's criticisms of Abraham Lincoln. And again, just to remind you, when I double back around to this, when it comes to democracy, and this even connects to what Biden had said, a while back, years ago, that if you're going to defend democracy and nationalism, you've got to have something holding that all together. And so when I weighed in on that topic in defending a critic's work, I was completely blasted. And I got to tell you, just my background as a Christian, as a gentleman, I will try to win an argument, and I like academic debate. But wow, I was taken aback by just the vitriol and the nastiness that bombarded me. And I made the mistake of, as a teacher, I went on this trip. I was involved in a debate online, and it was the same time as I was chaperoning a trip, and I was here locally at a theme park. And I was at the park, and I was kind of checking my inbox and notifications, and I kind of was going back and forth, and I had been involved in this. I was critiquing Lincoln, and his defenders were going back and forth. They were professors, they were writers, etc. And at one point, they just started cursing at me, and I was just looking at I was recommending some other things that had been written by some of his critics, sort of to support De Lorenzo's work, and then weighing in myself. And it got really nasty. This was that particular evening, and I was cursed at, and essentially I was kicked out of the chat room. And that didn't necessarily surprise me, but when I got to thinking about that, and the more that I studied and learned from some of the people who I mentioned to you have kind of opened my eyes as an academic, as a scholar, as a historian, that in my own writings, I've criticized plenty of presidents, and others have as well. But Abraham Lincoln really was the guy who made that great leap from, as we talked about last time, a federal republic to a nation. And just to reiterate, because it's going to be a recurring theme, I'd like to think, in my show, that we're not a nation, we're a republic with many constituent parts. And in fact, constitutionally speaking, the states that we have do maintain most of the sovereignty. They maintain most of the power. Or I should say they maintain their own sovereignty and most of the power. Now with Lincoln, that really changed in 1861 to 65 during the Civil War, so-called. Because what Lincoln had decided to do in the midst of his presidency, which is one term and then the beginning of another before assassination, is to reinvent Thomas Jefferson and to make a republic into a democracy and a quote-unquote nation. He had to sort of refashion what Jefferson had intended with the Declaration. And I'm not going to go into all the nuts and bolts of that in this particular show. What I will say, though, is those of you that have been to D.C., when you picture being there, right? Picture walking through the statues and the memorials and the monuments, etc. And they're really fantastic to see. They really are. Many of them are masterpieces. They're really interesting. There are great stories behind them. And it's a pretty cool experience in general, right? But remember last time I mentioned that in a Jeffersonian country, as we were, arguably up through the Civil War, and even later to a degree, Jeffersonian republicanism was always based on modesty, humility, simplicity, frugality, a government that was not seeking to necessarily expand its power and prestige. Those would happen, and of course, even Jeffersonians, to a degree, some of them had that bent or that outlook. But by and large, the whole idea of a republic, lowercase r, is based on a kind of modesty and understanding of one's limitations. And when Lincoln kind of put those nails in the coffin during the Civil War, so-called, I guess we should get that out of the way right up front. Really, it's a war between the states. It's not really a civil war because neither side the South wasn't trying to conquer the government or take over the government. But my point is this: that when you make that leap into nationhood, as Lincoln did, it was only then fitting that you had to create a mythology around that. So Lincoln's death, the untimely death in April of 1865, sort of almost guaranteed that as a martyr, he would become the high priest of democracy, right? So on that note, picture and sort of go back, if you will, the last few years on the heels of January 6th, the hooliganism that ensued on that day. Well, when Biden gave speeches about it, and there were many speeches, right? When he spoke out about that, if you go back and listen to it, you'll notice that the recurring theme here was that our sacred democracy was under attack, right? It was the whole idea of the sanctity of what democracy is or was. And moreover, what I find really intriguing is when he spoke out on this, he mentioned the Capitol building, of course, because that's where the event took place, right? The whole Stop the Steal shenanigans. But he called that building the sacred people's capital. It's a sacred building. Now, what's really funny about this is the event itself obviously came a year after, so it was a year after COVID, thereabouts. But if you go back during 2020, the summer of that year, there were literal religious buildings, churches being burned, right? And they were in flames. And I don't recall hearing a lot of his cadre speak out about that and condemn that kind of violence or say that there was any kind of blasphemy. But as far as the Capitol in D.C., right, this American stronghold of democracy, a lot of religious imagery, there's this whole veneer of that. And remember that, states, countries have to do this to sort of defend themselves. And that's really what Biden has done. And it's not just Biden. So this certainly is not just a Democrat or Republican thing. But it obviously, what happened on January 6, 2021, necessitated this sort of really aggressive defense of what leaders always deem to be sacred. And Lincoln really has been the focal point of that since his assassination in 1865. And a lot of that is because of his background and what he represented. And of course, a lot of other things there that we'll go into at some point in the show. But I want to focus on that today and that experience I mentioned with being kicked out of a chat room. And remember at one point the guy said, I guess we had all gotten frustrated, and I kind of still remember the names, and I won't throw them under the bus here. Of course, they might do the same with me. But a couple of the guys eventually said, after cursing at me, they said, "We bid you a fond farewell. You're essentially not welcome here in this particular blog." And I know the guy still writes, and he still is, he weighs in and helps others write books on Lincoln, etc. But I thought it was pretty revealing that during that exchange, I had poked fun of FDR and Truman and Woodrow Wilson, and even TR, in fact, who is another kind of like, he's lionized by both the left and the right. But when it came to Lincoln, that elicited profanity. And that was pretty telling, right? And that was a long time ago. But to reinforce this, just last year, I was fortunate enough to chaperone a really cool trip to D.C. here at the school that I teach at. And it was a large group of freshmen. And it was a great experience. The kids really carried themselves well, I thought. And this particular event really, I was taken aback and I was almost shocked at what happened. So I'll share it briefly. So this was like day 3, I believe, and it was evening. It was a little chilly and kids were kind of wound up. These are freshmen. So these are essentially 14, 15-year-old kids. And we were out and it was evening and we were at the Lincoln Monument. And, to piggyback on what I've already been saying, it's designed like the Parthenon. And don't miss that imagery and that symbolism, right? We are talking about an American god, an American demigod, an American holy figure, an American high priest. And so that's not accidental, that design, the stature. If you've never been there, when you approach the Lincoln Monument, you go up the steps. So you're already overwhelmed by having to go up. So you're looking upwards. When you get there, the figure is huge. It's a huge figure. And we were there that night on day 3 or day 4 that evening. It was chilly and we were kind of tired and the kids were just, they had a lot of pent-up energy from sitting on the bus back and forth from to and from venues. And they were running around, just kind of, burning some energy and being a little noisy, but certainly not doing anything really bad or disruptive, or they weren't defacing property or anything. And some guy across the way, some kind of big burly guy, just yelled at him and cursed at him. And he said, show some respect, and kind of gruff demeanor. And I initially thought he was a security guard. And as events unfolded, it turned out he was just a visitor, right? Just a pilgrim, if you will, to the Holy Land. And I didn't notice at first. What really creeped me out, though, when I looked at it, there were flowers placed at the foot of the Lincoln statue and around the base and near where the things were inscribed, right? And it really, I don't know why I'd never even thought of that before. And I've taught history over 20 years and I've studied it and I've got multiple degrees in the subject. But you talk about a creepy scenario, right? Lincoln is not buried there. He was buried in Illinois. And yet here, this American Parthenon, this American statue is there to remind you of his holiness and his sanctity, right? And this guy obviously had really bought into that, and he just cursed at these kids and yelled at them and was really gruff. And we were all just kind of shocked. And so the kids kind of wound down after that, and we were congregating and leaving and heading toward the buses at that point, so we were wrapping up. But the more that I processed it over the course of that was last year. So between now and then, and the subsequent months, I really have pondered this a lot, right? This idea of the civic religion. And the American civic religion essentially is that we are encouraged to, as citizens, to make sure that we know that the American state, the American government, its leaders, and especially its executive branch, are representatives and embodiments of its holiness, right? Its sanctity. And anything that blasphemes that goes against it, that questions it, whether it's an election, whether it's the esteem of the office or the decorum we're supposed to follow, that is all part of the civic religion. And Lincoln is, like I said, he's its high priest. He is its best representation. And it's almost like when he died, that all but guaranteed that. And as we go forward, we'll revisit this topic. But this idea of sacred democracy is really questioned. There's a great writer that I came across years ago, and it's one of those things where, when you start reading things and you go through your education, informal or formal, and you only realize later that you really should have went down some rabbit holes earlier than what you did. And I'm certainly not a really young man anymore. When I came across this guy, Frank Chodorov, I really just gravitated to him. And so the book I want to recommend, actually, it's an essay. It's called Washington, the American Mecca. And Chodorov was part of what was called the Old Right. And the Old Right, essentially, was this group of writers who really kind of coalesced around opposition to the New Deal. So think, mid-1930s, late 1930s, and then beyond, of course, after Roosevelt's death. But the Old Right was really open in their beliefs in classical liberalism, I guess you'd say. Free markets. They wanted a fairly minimal small state. They were against authoritarianism in all of its forms, and they were very consistent. And a lot of these other writers I will talk about as well. But Chodorov was really influential in shaping other writers who followed, obviously. And so when you look at a libertarian, quote-unquote, tradition going into the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and even up to now, a lot of them owe their sort of ideological origins to what Chodorov espoused and what he expressed. And he was a staunch opponent of this idea of how allegedly sacred, Washington is, or the American, state is, which, it might seem funny to say this, but most people around us, I think, on some level subscribe to that, and they believe in that. They might not necessarily say that it's holy, and especially if these are church-going people, they wouldn't necessarily say they find this tantamount to what their actual religion is or the faith is. But if you look at their approach to it, it is that way. And as we approach Veterans Day here, just look around you. Look at the hoopla. Look at the celebrations. And it's really kind of odd. And I don't want to go down another rabbit hole here. I've got limited time in this particular show. But, we have turned, now that it's 2024, and Veterans Day, its origins go back to 1918 with the end of the Great War. We've turned what had been a celebration that, thank God, the war's over, into a day of military revelry and celebrating all things martial. And even if people don't necessarily believe that's what they're doing, the ceremony indicates otherwise. And so part of that is built into, again, the sanctity of the state, so-called, right? Or the way that it's viewed and the way that it's sort of presented to us, right? And so Chodorov in the 1950s, so this particular one I'm going to share with you. It's so good. I've got to read some of it. It was published in a set of essays called The Fugitive Essays, which I'll link to. And this particular one, as I said, is called Washington, the American Mecca. And I like writers who are caustic and sardonic and have that kind of, cheeky sense of humor. So what I want to do is I want to read some of this to you. And I want to read just the beginning of it. And so he says, "It's June in Washington. It's June all over the country, of course, but to the capital city the month has special significance. It inaugurates the annual trek of gaping sightseers from all over the country to this American Mecca. Soon the vacationing school teachers will be eyeing and owing before the wondrous temples of government, while prize-winning high school students will pay their worshipful respects to the pompous dignitaries and official hirelings who carry on the affairs of state. Honeymooning couples, already taking one another for granted, will transfer their admiration and adoration to the index of political power, while farmers, satiated with the wonders of nature and their native habitats, will be propitiating the gods of government in their air-conditioned apses. In summer, it is the proper thing for Americans to come to Washington and view with awe." Now, here's my favorite part. Quote, "If you were to ask these visitors, they would tell you that they came here only to admire the beauty of the town. And to be fair, this is a beautiful town. Why shouldn't it be? It is like a harlot who never soils her hands with useful work, and whose only occupation outside of harlotry is to preen and primp at the expense of her admirers. Washington is and ought to be the most beautiful city in the country. It is also the most useless." So there you get a little feel for Chodorov's sense of humor and his caustic, very H.L. Mencken-esque wit, which is another thing that I greatly admire, the willingness to just kind of challenge authority and stay with that. And, in closing, I think what I most admire about the old right and their sort of opposition to the whole sort of Lincoln FDR type figures who are, embodiments of the state and what the state's supposed to be, to people who protect its interests. What I most admire about these guys is their consistency. And so in future episodes, you'll hear me mention whether it's Chodorov or H.L. Mencken or guys like John T. Flynn and many others, and who, again, influence, later libertarians or part of the libertarian movement. We are sorely lacking intellectual consistency in our elites and our leaders. And look, as far as politicians, those who are protecting the sanctity of democracy as they see it, I don't expect anything else. I expect political opportunism. I expect pandering. I expect them to be very Machiavellian. And no doubt there are good ones. There are some good ones out there with integrity, obviously at some, on some level. But by and large, you don't get to those positions by being people of intellectual consistency and integrity. I would argue you get there through ambition, right? And through this lust for power, as Chodorov just essentially points out. But we are really lacking that. And one thing I try to tell my students, is I try to withhold some of the cynicism, and I try not to let it drip out too much in my discussions with them, because I genuinely want to engage with them and want to teach them to be critical thinkers while also maintaining optimism and human spirit and faith, etc. But I tell my students, whether you are on the left or the right, whatever party you are, whatever party's beliefs you are sort of an adherent of, we're looking for consistency. And what we've seen instead over the last several years especially is just sides ostracizing people who had been stalwarts. And it's not that the stalwarts had changed, it's that the sides are switching for the sake of trying to gain power or one up the other side. So yes, I'll link to this. I highly recommend Frank Chodorov's Fugitive Essays, and that particular one, the Washington, the American Mecca. It is that particular set of essays, I believe it was published in 1954. It is just chock full of his ruminations on these topics, and it's got everything from history to economics to sort of culture, and the way that our politics impact that. And it's funny when you read this 54, especially on the heels of what happened, actually what's happened the last decade or so, it's still fresh, and I think it's always a sign of a good writer. So we'll see you next time.